The Mill Owner's Daughter.
Chapter 4. Irene Rose turned on her side, slowly opening her eyes, her hands searching for Michael. The space beside her felt warm, but it was empty. She stretched and thought about the events of the previous evening. They'd had guests to dinner, a dozen men in total, half of them accompanied by wives or sweethearts. Every one of the men, and most of the women, were Chartists or trade unionists, the majority both. It was the first weekend in June 1842. The last few months of 1841 had witnessed sporadic outbreaks of wage-cutting and workers' resistance, the latter being uneven and not always successful. The mill hands at Drosedon's New Mill and Lomas Mill had returned to work victorious, having dealt their owners an unexpected bloody nose. Others weren't so well organised. Those at Medlock Mill had succumbed to their master's wishes without resistance. This in turn had encouraged half a dozen more Drosedon mill owners to cut wages, and again, with the exception of Lum Mill on the edge of Littlemoss, the masters achieved success. Nonetheless, workers were learning lessons, and trade union membership in the town was growing apace, even in the mills where workers had failed to put up any resistance. Apart from a brief confrontation involving the Clayton colliers, the activity seemed to be confined to Drosedon, but during the spring of 1842, further outbreaks occurred as far afield as Ashton-under-Lyne, Blackburn, Bolton and Chorley. Michael O'Donnell became convinced the manufacturers were probing and testing the state of union organisation and the workers' ability and willingness to fight back. In preparation, he assumed for a larger and more coordinated confrontation, probably along the lines Matthew had predicted the previous year. With the downturn in trade developing fast, the Anti-Corn Law League stepped up its own campaigns. The leadership of the slowly developing trade union movement throughout Salford, Manchester and the surrounding towns of South East Lancashire and North East Cheshire was replete with Chartists. As a result, at every mass meeting of workers, they continually stressed the need to fight for the 6 points of the Charter, alongside the immediate fight against wage cuts, and stressed the importance of the continuing campaign for the 10-hour bill. Chartism's roots lay in the need to link the disparate struggles for trade union rights and against the Combination Acts and their successor, the Master and Servant Act, for the repeal of the Poor Law, the extension and enforcement of the Factory Acts, the agitation for the 10-hour day, and the ending of child labour, neglect and abuse, all of which fed into it. At first, this struggle for universal male suffrage, vote by ballot, the ending of property qualifications to stand for elections, equal constituencies, paid MPs to enable the poorest to stand for election, and annually elected parliaments to make MPs more accountable to their electorate and to minimise corruption, was carried out by a collection of loosely knit, locally based organisations. These mainly comprised sections of the lower middle class, alongside its main base of working class members, both classes having been denied the franchise by the 1832 Electoral Reform Act. Following the euphoria of the great demonstration on Kersal Moor in 1838, Chartism seemed to lose its initial momentum. A follow-up demonstration at the same venue in March 1839 attracted far less support, although 30,000 people did turn out. In June, the first monster petition for the implementation of the Charter had been presented to Parliament and dismissed out of hand by an overwhelming majority of MPs without any debate. This off-handed treatment of a petition signed by over 1.5 million people, the result of many thousands of hours of patient argument and hard endeavour, created widespread anger amongst working people, and there were many who felt violent methods were needed to secure their rights. The total British electorate at the time, including Ireland, was only 800,000, out of a population of some 22 millions. A meeting in Rochdale, held on the 25th of June that year, for the purpose of strengthening the organisation of the Chartist movement, and intent on calling for a national holiday in August, a euphemism for a general strike, had been infiltrated by government spies. Key members of the Chartist leadership, including Fergus O'Connor, were arrested in the July and August and imprisoned in Britain if lucky, transported to Australia if not. Divisions plagued the leadership, and for many the abortive Newport uprising in November 1839 was the final straw. By 1840 it was clear if Chartism had a future, it had to be placed on a firm national organisational base. It required democratic local structures and an elected national executive, rather than rely on its many gifted orators and flamboyant personalities, such as Fergus O'Connor, to draw crowds to monster meetings. James Leach played a key role. Chartist meetings took place throughout Britain in the spring and summer of 1840. A National Chartist Delegate Conference, held in Manchester on the 20th of July at the Griffin Tavern on Great Ancoats Street with Leach in the chair, considered a number of competing options, finally forming the National Charter Association, thus inaugurating what was to become the world's first working-class political party. Subsequently elected President of the National Charter Association by branch ballot, with every member, male and female, having the right to vote, James could rightly claim to be the first man elected by a national ballot to lead a working-class organisation. Indeed, he was the first man in British history to be elected to any political organisation by national ballot. The National Charter Association quickly grew in stature and numbers. In February 1841, Chartists were organised in 80 branches. By December, there were 300 branches, and over 350 by April 1842. The organisation continued to enjoy vigorous growth, particularly in the north of England, the Midlands, and the industrial belts of Scotland and South Wales, with widespread support amongst members of the newer craft trade unions and within their leaderships. May 1842 witnessed the second Chartist petition presented to Parliament. It contained over 3.5 million signatures, a quite amazing number, exceeding the electorate returning the MPs to office by 4 to 1. Once more the Commons rejected it out of hand, and once more they inflamed the temper of the majority disenfranchised working classes. An editorial in the Northern Star, which Irene Rose had framed to show any who attempted to undermine the case of working people and their rightful cause, stated, 3.5 millions have quietly, orderly, soberly, peaceably, but firmly asked of their rulers to do justice, and their rulers have turned a deaf ear to that protest. 3.5 millions of people have asked permission to detail their wrongs and enforce their claims for right, and the House has resolved they should not be heard. 3.5 millions of the slave class have holden out the olive branch of peace to the enfranchised and privileged classes, and sought for a firm and compact union on the principle of equality before the law, and the enfranchised and privileged have refused to enter into a treaty. The same class is to be a slave class still. The mark and brand of inferiority is not to be removed. The assumption of inferiority is still to be maintained. The people are not to be free. The old idea of a holy month or a month of Sundays, as Bess Ackroyd used to describe it, a general strike for the implementation of the People's Charter, was once again being discussed. Chartists were not alone in stepping up their activity. With the Tory government in power, the publications of the Anti-Corn Law League and the speakers at its public meetings were adopting a more radical, strident, and at times pseudo-revolutionary tone, calling on workers to rebel against rising food prices. In February, on the 14th, a meeting of Liberals, including supporters of the Anti-Corn Law League and lower middle-class Chartists, drew up a petition urging the repeal of the Corn Laws and the adoption of the Charter. Throughout the spring, distress increased and agitation grew as the downturn in trade developed. Sections of the middle classes, determined to force the repeal of the Corn Laws and defeat the Tory government, showed a propensity to forgo their law-abiding habits, although they were trying to whip up the working classes to do their work for them, whilst they stood back as onlookers. If caught with their pants down, they would insist, "It weren't me, Gov." It was against this rapidly developing background that the dinner party for Irene Rose's and Michael O'Donnell's guests had taken place. The growing industrial unrest, the increased agitation by the Anti-Corn Law League, and the need to step up the campaign for the Charter and the 10-hour bill holding centre stage in the lively discussions taking place during the meal and afterwards. The trade recession, now some 2 years old, had deepened, and the downturn predicted by Matthew Etherow has started to bite hard, its chilly breeze even blowing up the hitherto seemingly invincible iron corsets of Manchester's fast-growing engineering industry, stoking working-class hunger further. His theory on the cotton manufacturers' intentions to link the Anti-Corn Law League campaign with further wage cuts, turnouts and working-class agitation gained credibility, and even trade union activists who tended to view it as being rather far-fetched recognised the sense in making preparations. Since the beginning of 1840, most workers had suffered 3 separate wage cuts and were taking home 70% of the old wage rate. Top-paid weavers were down to 8 shillings a week, and rents averaged 3 shillings a week. Another cut would devastate all. Imaginations ran riot amongst Irene Rose's guests, new tactics devised and thought about, theories of how workers might influence and direct events, and take some control of their workplaces in the case of turnouts or lockouts submitted to the test of argument and peer review. Gradually, a general policy began to emerge, the responsibility for the implementation of which would initially rest on the shoulders of one man, who all present agreed to support. Alexander Hutchinson, an engineer and delegate of the Manchester wire drawers and card makers, had been instrumental in persuading the National Charter Association to hold its annual conference marking the anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester on the 17th and 18th of August, when a statue of Areta Hunt was to be publicly unveiled. The Chartists and trade unionists around Irene Rose's table agreed that if the present industrial unrest continued, a conference of trade delegates should take place to provide leadership and coordination of the workers' struggle against wage cuts immediately before the Chartist convention, their intention being to influence the latter and persuade it to provide national political leadership to the workers' economic struggle. They agreed to support the election of Hutchinson as chairman of the Trades Conference, and that of Charles Stewart, a delegate of the mechanics from Patricroft, as secretary. They agreed to campaign to win the conference to link the demands of the workers with support for the Charter, whilst voicing opposition to the Anti-Corn Law League. The latter aim was important, indeed crucial, if the false claims of the Anti-Corn Law League to represent working people were to be undermined. Irene Rose had thoroughly enjoyed the evening and taken full advantage of the proceedings to not only voice her own opinions but to draw on others' knowledge and thus augment her own. It was of course unusual for women to enjoy discussing such lofty subjects, hitherto regarded as the monopoly domain of men. She noticed how many of the women present tended to keep to themselves, away from their menfolk, although most participated in vigorous debates of their own. Nonetheless, Irene Rose soon discovered the tale of her intervention at Lomas Mill had achieved almost legendary status, and the men tended to accept her as one of them, even though some still tended to be patronising. In such cases, Irene Rose had her own subtle means of retaliating, which tended to add levity to the evening, at least for those men and women more sympathetic to the feminist cause. John Doherty and James Leach had taken the trouble to introduce her to Alexander Hutchinson. Later on she found young Albert Ashton entertaining, as well as informative about the role of the women operatives in organising the new union structures at Lomas Mill. She'd informed him of the cooperative enterprise in Ancoats, and he'd agreed to bring a delegation of spinners to view it and learn how it was organised, being intent on emulating the Gibraltar Mill workers' endeavours. At this point, Rose's husband, emerging into the bedroom with a tray on which china rattled, a milk jug wobbled, and a teapot balanced, rudely interrupted Irene Rose's recollections of the dinner party. "Breakfast in bed, Rose," he announced, placing the tray on the small table next the bed as he walked over to draw the curtains and allow the morning sunshine to flood the room. "Leave the curtains for now, Michael," she responded, struggling upright. She patted the eiderdown. "Come here, my love, drink your tea and come back to bed." Whilst his daughter, for once in her life, enjoyed the luxury of staying abed, Matthew Etherow was already up and doing. He'd arranged to meet Councillor Davitt and Daniel Ackroyd at Mary's Kitchen, with a view to showing Davitt how his scheme to improve his workers' housing was proceeding, and to draw attention to problems he thought it was the responsibility of the corporation to address. He left his home at Ardwick Green in an ebullient mood. His spirits soared, having been more than a little impressed by the discussion the previous evening. His confidence progressive social change could be achieved growing. Unlike most of the manufacturers, Matthew had always viewed working people with respect, not least because he and his fellow mill owner and brother George had started work as apprentices at the age of 8 in their father's first mill. As a result, they not only gained a good grounding in every aspect of mill work, but also knew intimately the conditions and privations their fellow apprentices and their parents suffered in their domestic lives. The quality of the discussion and debates at the dinner party, the constructive atmosphere in which they had taken place, and the good-humoured and indeed often jocular way points were made, had only served to reinforce and broaden his respect. As he walked down London Road and crossed the Medlock, enjoying the sunshine, he compared his daughter's get-together with similar events organised by his fellow mill owners and other industrialists. All too often, any discussions and debates in the latter soirees tended either to be an extension of the marketplace, where deals were done and favours sought, or descended into a form of vulgar boasting, an ostentatious display of wealth and possessions, included in which were the manufacturer's mobile jewels and chattels, their decorative wives and daughters. The latter often found themselves bartered for marriage, to cement business deals and build manufacturing and financial dynasties, whilst their husbands' business rivals often seduced the former, as if such liaisons were part and parcel of the natural competition between individual capitalists. Of course, when such adulteries and fornications took place, they had to remain hidden and secret, so as not to offend the prevailing Victorian version of morality. However, the same morality allowed children and adults to die in poverty and starvation, and as long as such poverty remained hidden from the gaze of the privileged few, they could deny its existence. Victorian morality was essentially Janus-like, a bit like Manchester's buildings, the finest line in the main thoroughfares open to the public gaze, with the dankest, dirtiest and darkest houses of the labouring masses carefully hidden away, where they could be ignored. There were those who regarded the reality of Victorian middle-class marriage as little more than a thinly veiled form of prostitution. Matthew tended to sympathise with them, knowing all too well how many had married for money or prestige rather than love, how the wives of his fellow manufacturers were often exploited and degraded by their husbands, and how many of the women cheated in their turn. In the brave new anarchic world of laissez-faire capitalism, all relationships tended to be reduced to cash relationships, and the middle-class form of marriage was no exception to the rule. Apart from Irene Rose and himself, all the guests at the Ardwick house had been people who suffered at one time or another the worst privations and excesses of the manufacturing system, and had somehow managed to fight back. They pulled themselves, along with others, out of the morass into which they had been submerged, educated themselves and each other, and throughout remained loyal to their class. Their clothes may have been of rough fustian cloth, rather than worsted wool or fine linen, their hands cut and calloused, their accents rough and ready, but they could speak out in a language common people understood. They could put across well-thought-out arguments and complex ideas. Most had no formal education, yet they taught each other to read and write. Many, like the handloom weaver Samuel Bamford, composed poetry and songs, whilst others authored inspiring treatises and stimulating books. Many were accomplished musicians, and others painters and artists. They were familiar with the works of Bacon and the latter materialists, Hobbes, Locke and Collins, Dodwell, Coward, Hartley and Priestley, who, having demolished theism and theology, had placed materialist philosophy on a sound foundation. Michael O'Donnell's friend and compatriot John Doherty, James Leach, Abel Heywood and other working-class publishers made the works of St. Simon, Fourier, Rousseau and other philosophers available in English translations, as well as publications by Carlyle, Thomas Paine, Robert Owen and many more. often issuing them in serialised form to make them affordable. John Doherty, who had attended the dinner party with his wife Laura, had particularly impressed Matthew. They talked about the campaign against child labour and for the protection of children generally. John had presented the mill owner with a copy of a memoir of Robert Blincoe, a narrative written by John Brown of the life of a pauper child which he, Doherty, had published. St Pancras Workhouse in London had sold Robert Blincoe as an indentured and unpaid apprentice to the owners of Loudon Mill in Nottingham, who subsequently sold him on to the owners of Lytton Mill in Derbyshire's Peak District, a particularly cruel and barbaric set of employers. Robert subsequently moved to Manchester, where he met and campaigned with Doherty against the scourge of child labour. Some think Dickens read the story of his life, and it forms the basis for his novel Oliver Twist. Above all other qualities that impressed Matthew, these representatives of the working poor instinctively knew the importance of solidarity. In some cases it was felt subconsciously, whilst in others it was very much a conscious thing, but each in their own way espoused the principle that the basic condition for the advancement of each individual worker was the advancement of all. They were essentially class-conscious people who were coming to understand their personal liberation could only be achieved together in cooperation and unity through the liberation of the working class as a whole, and in achieving this they could liberate all classes. The middle classes and the landed gentry wrote working people off almost as if they comprised a subhuman species incapable of making sensible decisions, let alone run complex enterprises or engage in politics and government. They justified the long hours and low wages they subjected their workers to by arguing it was essentially for their benefit. Shorter hours would lead to drunkenness and idleness, higher wages to a diet too rich for their constitutions. In the same way, employing children at back-breaking tasks kept them off the streets and out of mischief. It taught them civility and respect for their masters. Thus again, it was for the child's benefit. The idea they needed a childhood and should be allowed to play, explore and learn about the world in which they lived, taken for granted not so long ago, had become a completely alien and revolutionary concept. Matthew thought otherwise. He carefully weighed up his own interests and his standing within manufacturing society, placed them on the scales and tested them against his humanist goals, his social and scientific knowledge, his personal morality, and his strong belief that all human beings were created equal and were dependent on each other. He decided to stick with and develop his own moral code and to support the advancement of the workers' struggles for a better life, with any and all the means at his disposal. Matthew remained convinced the next few weeks and months would test the integrity and purpose of the men and women Irene, Rose and Michael had assembled the night before. Every instinct told him great events were soon to take place, and tremendous social forces unleashed, which could well determine the political and social character of Britain for decades to come. He'd soon be proved right, although his sense of timing was a little out. The time was already upon them. The initial skirmishes had taken place, and the real major clashes were only days away. They wouldn't commence in Manchester or the surrounding textile towns, but further south, and for once the cotton manufacturers were not directly involved, although other manufacturers were, and they soon would be. The struggle about to ensue would also have significant and lasting repercussions outside Britain, not least in its penal colony, Australia.